Welcome today, June 13th, 2018, to Neo 420 Studios. We're here again talking all things cannabis and hemp, plus some other stuff. We're here with a great friend of ours, David Dawson. David, how are you doing today, my friend?
Everything is good. I had some computer issues for a while, but we're under control now.
Excellent. Well, glad to have you. Good to see you again. What are we going to talk about today? I knew that we had been talking offline about a few things, but get us up to date.
Well, what I was thinking I'd like to talk about today, if it would be okay with you, is the evidence that the DEA, or Drug Enforcement Agency, uses to justify the Schedule I classification of cannabis.
Oh yes. Very much so. Let's talk about that.
Well, this is something that I've been looking at real recently through my university, through my PhD studies, and basically what I wanted to do was kind of get a sense as to what the justification that the DEA uses to classify cannabis as having no medicinal value whatsoever. And the evidence that they cite when they make this claim. And so what I've done is kind of spent some time analyzing this evidence, and so that's kind of what I'd like to discuss.
Yes, I would look forward to it. Please share what we know that the DEA has got a very opposed position to our plant. So please, let's share with us what you found out, David.
Okay, well, this is what, basically what we've got is, let's start kind of at the end, which is basically now. But what we're going to do is we're going to run through 8 decades of evidence that the DEA has. That the DEA cites anyway. Now, what we have to do is kind of look back. On August 11th, 2016, Chuck Rosenberg, the acting head of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, announced that it wouldn't change the federal legal status of cannabis, and that its classification would continue to remain Schedule I under the Controlled Substances Act. Meaning that that it has no medicinal use and a high potential for abuse. Chuck Rosenberg resigned as head of the DEA in September of 2017 after becoming convinced that President Trump had little respect for the law. So essentially, meet the new boss. Same as the old boss. Mm-hmm. Every administrator of the DEA has, since it was established, has held the same set of opinions. What we're going to kind of do is talk a little bit about who is currently in charge. His name is Robert W. Patterson, and I've got a quote from him. And here's what his quote is. "We have the final scheduling authority. Really, it comes down to science. That's the foundation of the argument. We're bound by that scientific and medical evaluation." So essentially what he's saying is that they have the authority and that the science justifies their positions, right? Or their decision. Now, I think if you're, I mean, Paul, you and I have spent a lot of time talking, and I've done a few of these podcasts with you, and I talk a lot about paradigms, scientific paradigms. Paradigms are worldviews that pretty much dictate a person's opinion about a subject. Now, Mr. Patterson is a cop at heart, which the United States has promoted to scientists. The paradigm of the cop is that they have the ruling authority to make medical decisions because they were granted that power in 1973, and the science backs up their position. And that's kind of what is key is that They believe that they have the science to back up the idea that cannabis has no medicinal value. So now I'm not going to really expose Mr. Patterson's scientific background because that would just be embarrassing. However, I kind of like this. I would consider it likely that he spent quite a lot of time analyzing the science produced by the United States, which demonstrates that cannabis has no medicinal value and a high potential for abuse. This is the paradigm that the DEA as an organization dedicated to science adheres itself to because they feel that they have the scientific evidence to support it. Obviously, the DEA must look back on 8 decades of science to base their medical decision on. And I've spent some time looking at the science that they cite to reach the conclusion that cannabis has no medicinal value. I have to admit that they stayed true to their paradigm. And as you can imagine, 8 decades is a long time to compile scientific research or scientific evidence. And realistically, there are 4 main events or studies which took place in those 8 decades to justify the paradigm to the scientists of the DEA. This presentation that I'm about to do with you is just kind of an annotated history of those 4 events.
Okay.
So that's kind of what we're looking at. Is just we're going to kind of go through the history of cannabis since the 1930s. And
Okay.
the evidence that is being cited by the DEA and the FDA when you push them to say, okay, what's the evidence that you guys have? When you push them, this is the evidence that they cite, and we're going to get into a lot of it. Actually, there's only really 4 things that occurred. Now, when you look at the roots of America's decision that cannabis has no medicinal value, you'll find that nearly all the roads lead to a man named Harry Anslinger. He was the one that established the precedent that in the United States, it is law enforcement officers that make the medical decisions. Anslinger was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which laid the groundwork for the modern-day DEA. And he was the first architect of the war on drugs. He was appointed to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930, just as prohibition of alcohol was beginning to crumble, and he remained in power for 32 years, okay? From the moment he took charge, Harry was in charge, he was aware of the weakness of his new position as director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He needed to be able to financially justify his new bureau's existence. And he knew he couldn't keep the entire department alive on narcotics alone. Cocaine and heroin were simply not used enough to sustain an entire bureau on. Very few people were using heroin and coke. He needed more. In order to fund his newly established bureau, Anslinger made it his mission to rid the United States of all drugs except alcohol and tobacco. Okay, and this included cannabis, which he chose to pursue with a vengeance. His influence played a major role in the introduction and passage of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which outlawed the possession and selling of cannabis without a tax stamp, which he ensured would be essentially impossible to obtain. Okay, so that's kind of Harry Anslinger. Now, Anslinger claimed that cannabis could cause psychosis and eventually insanity and death. In a radio address, he stated that young people are slaves, quote, slaves to this narcotic, continuing addiction until they deteriorate mentally, become insane, turn to violent crime, and eventually murder, unquote. The problem was he really had no evidence to support this. So what he did was he contacted 30 scientists. 29 of them told him that cannabis was not a dangerous drug. Mm. He hired the 30th. Okay, Dr. James Munch. as the U.S. government's official expert on cannabis. In this position, Dr. Munch was responsible for presenting the scientific evidence indicating that ingesting cannabis caused psychosis and eventually insanity. Now, this is probably a good time to introduce the concept of anecdotal evidence. It's the government's position that any success stories of individuals attaining successful medical results with cannabis as individual stories that should be ignored as unscientific. Anecdotal evidence does not qualify as scientific evidence because its very nature prevents it from being investigated by the scientific method. The personal stories of 4.3 million seniors who claim they are receiving relief of their ailments by supplementing their endocannabinoid system with phytocannabinoids is simply not compelling enough to change the evidence that the United States has relied on to advance the claim of the dangers of cannabis. The evidence that the United States uses to support this claim is based on the research of experts. One of the most notable experts is the aforementioned Dr. Munch. He was a professor of physiology and pharmacology in the School of Pharmacology at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And he was employed as the official expert on cannabis from 1938 to 1962. Okay. Now, in 1937, Dr. Munch testified for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics during the Marijuana Tax Act hearings of 1937. His court testimony demonstrates the importance of medical decisions being based on evidence, and America's decision that cannabis had no medicinal value is largely based on the findings of the esteemed Dr. Munch. All right, so he's a little bit key in this whole thing. During the hearing, he testified that cannabis was introduced into human medicine by William Brooke O'Shaughnessy in 1838. That was 37 years before Louis Pasteur came onto the scene. And Munch testified that before Pasteur, cannabis was used to treat rabies, corns, and sleep disorders. He correctly stated that synthetic medicines were better options for these conditions, and went on to testify that cannabis has no medicinal value because there is no established method for standardization of dose that compares to the exacting standards of synthetic narcotics. He further testified without producing studies that cannabis causes degeneration of the brain, extreme laziness, violent irritability, and disintegration of personality. He then stated in open court that he had conducted a series of experiments with cannabis on dogs, and for scientific purposes tried cannabis himself. When asked how cannabis affected him, Dr. Munch testified under oath that, quote, after 2 inhalations of a marijuana cigarette, I was turned into a bat, flew around the room, and down a 200-foot incline. I got better. Now, I know there's certainly got to be some recreational users out there that are going, yeah, I want the stuff that turns you into a bat. But yeah, so that's one of the things that now interestingly enough, this was not the evidence that President Ronald Reagan was referring to when in 1984 he declared, I now have absolute proof that smoking even one marijuana cigarette is equal in brain damage to being on Bikini Island during a nuclear blast. The study Reagan used to justify that was what was referred to as the Heath Lane study, 1974 study. And this study has been repressed and is only available by filing a request through the Freedom of Information Act. Now, we'll get to that study in a moment, but by the time Dr. Munch and Harry Anslinger retired from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1962, the government's paradigm had already been established. And this paradigm was to flourish within the government for the next 5 decades. In a nutshell, the paradigm is this. Ingesting cannabis kills brain cells, causes psychosis, criminal behavior, and insanity. Propelled along by Presidents Nixon, Reagan, Clinton, and Bush, the paradigm went virtually unchallenged. Okay, the next stop in the advancement of this paradigm is 1971, when Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs, specifically targeting cannabis and essentially declaring war on the cannabinoid molecules, mandating that they not be studied. At the time he declared war on cannabinoids, no one had a clue that he had effectively declared war on the molecules that the human body produces naturally. So the main postulates of the dominant paradigm that is still being promoted as science by the federal government, and that is that the molecules that the human body produces naturally to maintain homeostasis are harmful to humans if they are produced by a plant. Let's see, on July 1st, 1973, Richard Milhouse Nixon declared created the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, as a paramilitary division tasked with the responsibility of ensuring that no U.S. citizen would ever be allowed to possess or research the cannabis plant. However, an exception was made for one man, and that was a man by the name of Robert G. Heath. Okay, now the history of psychology is filled with tales of researchers pushing the boundaries of science and ethics. Dr. Heath had the background and the credentials the government wanted because he was one of the first physicians to implant electrodes deep inside the brain as a method of psychosurgical intervention. He was best known for using electrical stimulation as an attempt to cure patients of schizophrenia and as a method of conversion therapy for homosexual males. In addition to these studies, he conducted and published results of a study which he claimed to administer to rhesus monkeys 30 joints a day for a period of 1 year, which conclusively demonstrated the deleterious effects of ingesting cannabis. This is known as the Heath-Tulane study. It's probably one of the most important studies in cannabis history. When reporting the results of the study, Heath claimed that after the year was up, he killed the monkeys, counted the dead brain cells, and compared that number to the number of dead brain cells in monkeys that hadn't ingested cannabis. Okay, now the result of that study demonstrated conclusively that cannabis ingesting monkeys had significantly more dead brain cells than monkeys that hadn't ingested cannabis. And this study is cited quite frequently as proof that cannabis use kills brain cells, and is still being used as evidenced by the DEA to advance their paradigm that cannabis is one of the most dangerous substances a human can ingest. The Heath-Tulane study is the evidence that the DEA currently cites when pressed for scientific justification for cannabis remaining a Schedule I substance as destructive as heroin. All right, so that's kind of key. Now it's really extremely difficult to obtain an actual copy of the Heath-Tulane study. It requires filing a request through the Freedom of Information Act, and generally takes about 6 years to get a copy of that study. After repeated filings, a lawsuit, and great persistence and patience, a normal National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws was able to acquire a copy of that 1974 study in 1980. The actual methodology used in that study and the way the results were disseminated provide a really interesting lesson about the nature of science. In order to avoid having to pay an assistant's wages for every day for a full year, what he did was he strapped gas masks to the monkeys' made certain they were sealed, and pumped marijuana smoke into them for 5 minutes, not providing the monkeys any oxygen. According to the Red Cross life-saving and water safety manual, 3 to 5 minutes of oxygen deprivation causes brain damage. It turns out that the Heath Tulane study was actually a study on animal asphyxiation. The monkeys suffered brain damage due to being completely deprived of oxygen and exposed to smoke with carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide instead. The brain damage was the result of lack of oxygen. Okay. However, this is the study that was cited by Ronald Reagan when he said marijuana is probably the most dangerous drug that we have in America today. And this is the study cited by the FDA when pressed for scientific evidence justifying its decision that cannabis has no medicinal value. Mm. This is the paradigm we're battling, and when in reality, the reality is this. The only species on Earth human beings have a scientifically demonstrable symbiotic relationship with is cannabis. Now, humans have a tendency to muck up relationships, and for a variety of inane reasons, a federal bureaucracy created by humans attempted to destroy this one. Okay, so this is where we're at, and this is kind of what the paradigm that we're battling right now is. Okay, I ran through that pretty fast, and I know I read it, but I'm going to be presenting this at the Florida Cannabis Convention, and it's actually a PowerPoint presentation, so it's got some real pretty pictures that kind of go along. And of course, I couldn't really share the pictures, but
that's unbelievable to me. All of the history that you've stated here, David.
It's an incredible history, and the interesting thing is, it seems to be all about economics.
For sure.
For a few. Some racial stuff thrown in by Anslinger just because it was, I guess it was probably appropriate at the time to do it that way. But when it got down to it, the reason that he decided to go after cannabis was because he needed something to fund his bureau on.
Yep. Well, it's funny just in thinking about those 4 different periods and those 4 different events that occurred and the individuals that are involved. I'm thinking about the last one that you mentioned about the report that was actually more focused around animal asphyxiation and brain damage.
The Tulane study, and that one is key, right? Because that's the one that's being used right now to justify, no medicinal value.
It's ironic to me that they used cannabis in that manner because we know now that cannabis helps with traumatic brain injuries.
Right.
So
yeah. But the problem is it's not going to help if you don't provide the person any oxygen.
True. But I'm just thinking that even with the rationale and direction of how they were attempting to discredit cannabis, they probably actually did not go to the extent because of their methodology.
Right, yeah. Well, of course, by that time, actually, probably not by that time, but the United States holds the patent on using cannabis as a neuroprotectant and to help people that have suffered like strokes or CTE, concussions or anything like that. The United States owns the patent to use cannabinoids in that way, or to use particular cannabinoids like THC.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. And so, but they still have come out with, and the question is, okay, why? Why are they not exploiting this patent that they have? I mean, if it got down to it, if they had exploited the patent when I had my stroke, I'd be owing them a ton of money.
Oh, yeah.
Um, you know, and the interesting thing is, you know, I mean, the neuroprotective qualities and the neuroregeneration qualities that have helped me, you know, I mean, it ended up that I'm using these molecules illegally because the United States just says, okay, we're not going to exploit that patent. We're gonna make the claim that that it causes brain damage.
Mm-hmm.
When in reality, it's the opposite.
Well, that's always the government's way of talking to us, right?
Right.
They say exactly the opposite of what is meant to be interpreted. So we just have to know how to read between the lines. But this presentation, David, of how you presented this is very strong because it weeds away a lot of the propaganda and fluff that's been put around the facts.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. But this is you know, I mean, I've spent a lot of time just digging up a lot of this research, and it's just, I mean, it just, as I got nearer and nearer to the end of this, I'm like, holy cow, you know what?
It's unbelievable. I mean, it's like you don't want to accept it
when you actually dig into the research of this, and the methodology that's been used, and so much like Dr. Munch turning into a bat just kind of blew me out of the water. You know?
Well, I think he probably had some kind of interest in some type of.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure there was some economic interest, and of course, you know, Anslinger had his little thing, and they had, you know, they had to keep that bureau funded.
Right.
And so, you know, they were able to do it. And,
well, they have to create a problem in order to make sure that they solve it for us.
They have to create a paradigm. They're a worldview, and that's what they did. They created this paradigm that you know, we're still operating under as a federal government. You know, we're still operating under this paradigm, and this is the way science works, and it's just incredible. I mean, I'm doing 2 programs up in Orlando. One actually is on the paradigms, you know, and that sort of thing, and then that leads into this one, and the, you know, the paradigm of the DEA.
What is that event that you're going to be presenting this at, David?
It's called Cannaday, Cannaday, Cannaday. It's in Orlando on July 14th.
Okay. And everyone could check out. Is that something that can be found online?
Yeah, you can find it online. I found it for a while, and then I had a hard time re-finding it. But I'm sure. Well, I think I posted it on my Facebook page, and of course it's out there. I would imagine that. I mean, it's through the Florida Cannabis Coalition. So if you Google Florida Cannabis Coalition, then you can, you know, they'll have access to it.
Okay. Well, I want to make sure that our audience knows where to check you out and check out that conference coming up in July.
Right. Yeah. Well, we'll have to. Let's see. Of course, you can always find me through Balance Bio.
Right.
That's you know. Now, if you I don't have quite a website yet, but you know, what is it? Balance Bio has the website, and you can always get to me through Balance Bio.
Okay, and that's balancebio.com? Yes,
all lowercase, and it'll take you right to the website. And my books are on there. And actually, they're the second editions of both books. So they're, you know, a little bit of update. The Medical Cannabis, the Definitive Guide, didn't need much updating, but I've updated it a little bit, a tiny amount. Pummeled to Death by Hamburger, which is my novel. That one, I did have to do some. Well, there was some stuff that I had to fix in that one, some grammatical errors and that sort of thing. Because I couldn't get a I couldn't get an editor to edit it at the first time around at a decent price, and so I was able to edit it better. So that book is on site too, and that one, if you just want to have a laugh about all the nonsense that goes on about cannabis, that's a really funny book.
Okay.
And that was one, you know. So like I said, you can always get to me through Balance Bio, and I am doing some cannabinoid counseling through Balance Bio, and kind of helping, you know, teaching patients how to medicate appropriately, methods of ingestion, dosing techniques, and that sort of thing for particular ailments. If somebody calls me and says, "Hey, I've got, you know, fibromyalgia, I've got a form of breast cancer, I've got, you know, this sort of thing," I can help them out through just kind of teaching them about, you know, what cannabinoids are appropriate, you know, the direction to go with that way, and that's kind of what I do.
Right. Well, I look forward to talking to you further about that specifically. I know you and I have been talking offline about that, so we'll definitely have you back on, because
sure.
And I wanted to let you know, I know you've talked to Uncle Jesse's family, but I really appreciate that assistance on that. Yeah. They're working through things, so your consultation on that level has helped tremendously. So
yeah, that's okay. You know, this is I mean, this is kind of what I do. I mean, I know a lot of stuff, and you know, I want to share that knowledge and help humanity with that knowledge.
Well, that's right. Well, that's why I appreciate having you on, David. Anytime. I look forward to talking to you again here real soon. We're going to wrap up today here at Neo 420 Podcast, talking all things cannabis and hemp, plus some other stuff. David, let us know again where they can get in touch with you, please.
Balancedbio.com. BALANCEDBIO.com.
Okay.
And that's the website. That's the easiest way to get in touch with me.
Okay, very good.
And and so that's the direction to go.
And the audience can get in touch with us at contact@neo420.com with any questions that they have for David. If you're not able to get in touch with him, feel free to use us as an intermediary. David, we always appreciate the time, my good friend. Look forward to talking to you again here real soon, okay?
Yeah, I would enjoy that.
Hey, be well.
A little less structured next time.
Yeah, well, you've got it now already, right? All right. Well, thanks again. Audience, stay tuned to neo420.com for all of your articles, information, news, photos about what's going on in the cannabis and hemp world. We appreciate all the support. Check us out at neo420.com/shop. We have some products out there, just like this beautiful Oregon t-shirt that we've got going on. That has these are our green state shirts that we like to promote to all the states where medical and recreational cannabis is legal. And follow us or like us and follow us on Facebook at Neo420 Media on Facebook. Go there now and like us, follow us, and share with your network, friends, and family. Thanks again, everybody. Until next time, David, my friend, stay medicated.